Welcome to Baruch College and to the School of Public Affairs. My name is David Birdsell. I'm the dean of the program here. And as the panelists set up, I'd like to say a few words in overview about what brings us here tonight and why we are talking about food and why food prompts a fight. And we may find out this evening exactly how much that's true with the very different opinions I'm sure that will be represented in the room today. We are, of course, a school of public affairs, a very large school of public affairs, in fact now the largest in the United States, with the traditional array of disciplines that you associate with public policy. We have economists trying to figure out what inputs create what outputs. We have people measuring program performance. We have people who care about housing and sustainable communities. We have a terrific health policy program. We have terrific environmental science, and particularly environmental policy. But we've never paid any attention to food. And then, 3 years ago, do I have that right, Jackie? 3 years ago, a group of students got together. Jackie Fortin was the founding president of the organization, and today's president is seated at the dais this evening, and put together a group called Food Matters. And what Food Matters was dedicated to is trying to meld the personal and the political, if you will, but also trying to meld the personal and the policy related. Food has inevitable policy dimensions to it. If we're talking about trying to ensure the integrity of the food supply, we're talking about trying to take steps to measure the extent to which we can actually grow and move food from point A to point B to the many millions of mouths that need to receive it on a daily basis. Food matters if we're assessing nutritional sufficiency and the ability to feed adequately with whatever standards we decide upon the foods that they need to access and maintain those standards. Food matters if we're thinking about how we grow that food, what we put on it to make it grow, and what kinds of transportation systems we use to move them from place to place. Some of them are very carbon intensive, some of them much less carbon intensive. We're now seeing across the United States a tremendous movement out of architecture schools and urban planning programs, and actually on the ground building for vertical gardening, urban gardening, hydroponic activities, and indeed now over 50 high schools in New York have gardens attached to them, many on their roofs, and these are places where young people learn about the business of food. It gets much bigger than the high school, but the business of food, the process of growing it, and what it means to sustain healthy habits themselves. It's a vast constellation of issues. But the people involved in Food Matters, the students who led it and the students who constitute that organization, by the way, it is now the largest substantively focused student organization at Baruch College, meaning focused on an aspect of academic activity. That's a remarkable thing to be able to say. They have convinced me and have convinced my colleagues that this is a place in which we, as a responsible institution, attentive to the changing dynamics of the policy environment, need to make an investment. So we are going to hire for the first time a professor of food policy. That job announcement is out. It's a wonderful thing. You made that happen, folks, so there is power in conversation. But that person is expected to join us in the fall. We don't know who that will be, and we don't know exactly which area of food policy that person will command, but we will build over time the ability to fold into our understanding of the policy imaginative, if you will, what it means to eat, what it means for the future of our environment, what it means for the future of our health system, what it means for the prospects of our populations to eat in accordance with policies that are intentionally chosen, deliberately stewarded, and safely evaluated. Now, that's all you guys have to talk about tonight. If you can cover that, everything will be fine. Clearly, we aren't going to go to all of these places tonight, but we have people talking about a variety of issues that are salient in food policy debates, and they will engage in a lively discussion about how we can best understand what our commitments are, both here at Baruch and throughout the city and indeed the nation and the world as we contemplate this vast, vast array of issues that we link under food policy. The moderator this evening has the pleasure of introducing the panel, but I have the great pleasure of introducing the moderator. He is sitting in the center. His name is Seamus McKiernan, and he is the blog editor of special projects at the Huffington Post, where he is also a writer and an editor on politics, health, food, and other subjects. And the Health Beat is a relatively new innovation at the Huffington Post, and Seamus has been stewarding that from the inception. He also contributes to the Huffington Post's Food for Thought, which is focused on well-being and sustainability. He is a co-founder of the popular section Generation Y, a HuffPost project that highlights the voices of young adults with chronic disease. He has written about food for Complex magazine, and he recently appeared on The Rachel Ray Show. Please don't tell anybody in Food Matters what you ate there. In any case, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the dais and to moderate this evening's panel, Seamus McKierney.
So thanks everyone for being here. Can you hear me? I'm so glad to be here. So I'm an editor at the Huffington Post, and in the fast-moving world of internet publishing, things change a lot, but I've noticed that a through line and a thread is always food. So in our lives, food matters a lot, from our choices that we make every day, what we eat. But in the news business, you find food in places you wouldn't necessarily even think of. So I'm drawn here today to have this discussion because in news I see food in healthcare stories, in stories about poverty. Some people may have seen the New York Times story today about poverty, youth poverty in New York City. Has to do with climate change and energy, and even national security and defense. So all of you know this well, and that's what we're going to talk about here. But coming from a news background, that's really interesting. I think of food as like this intersection. So maybe we can think about that today. Before I introduce people, I want to focus both on, I think, the enormous challenges of the food movement and the food industry. It can be overwhelming and maybe even paralyzing for discussion. So I think that's the importance of today's discussion. So it would be a disservice to overlook those challenges, but also it would be to not focus on some concrete ways that are points of optimism and light and brightness, and we can come up with maybe one or two of those today, or some ideas that would be a good accomplishment. So let me introduce everyone on the panel. Starting to my right at the end, Dr. Jonathan Sacna Bernstein. He's a cardiologist now, but also formerly worked for the FDA. So he might be able to bring some of that to light. And then next is Ezra Fields, a managing director for Rork Capital Group, which is a private equity that does investments in food and consumer businesses. To my left, a student here at Baruch College, an MPA candidate, and the president of the group Food Matters, which was just mentioned, Angelica Martinez. And also from the college and the School of Public Affairs, an associate professor, Diane Gibson, who focuses on public health, and including areas of food deserts and other things which you can go into. So that's the panel. I wanted to start with a brief intro by each panelist on what you think is the greatest challenge today in the food industry, and then a point of maybe surprise or something that gives you a little bit of hope or something that's new. Shall we start with Jonathan Sacna Bernstein?
Sure. Thank you very much, Seamus, and to the organizers. Working for my career, first as a cardiologist, then working at the Food and Drug Administration, one of the things that really became a focus of mine was how data can drive decisions, especially when you're dealing with sciences. And if you look at what people are doing vis-a-vis the obesity and overweight explosion in our country and globally, what you see is a very troublesome way that people are using data. What I mean by that is that if I were a drug company developing a pill to treat obesity, and I found that that drug could reduce people's weight by 5 to 10 pounds over the course of the year, not only would I as the developer hail that as an incredible accomplishment, but from a public health point of view, it would be approached as a great breakthrough, transformative for society. Yet here we are at a time where multiple dietary strategies, whether you talk about any of the popular ones, the old ones, depending upon how an individual responds or a group responds, can lead to a loss of 15 or 20 pounds without the side effects that are always going to be part of a drug use when it's widespread. Yet those are viewed as being things to be brushed aside, things that shouldn't be incorporated into daily practice, things that should be derisively written about in some of the recent guidelines. So I'm hoping that as conversations like this one start to happen here tonight, as they extend elsewhere, people stay grounded in the science and the data and make the decisions based on the science and the data?
Well, as someone who spends my day investing in the food industry, I see the regulatory side of the equation from the other side of the table, and have thought about some of the challenges of even getting, hypothesize if we asked 5 of Jonathan's former colleagues at the FDA what constitutes good nutrition, which is something we're all here to discuss, I think we would get 4.5 answers. And the problem is that 3 of them are right. But they're not right for everyone at all times. And so as I look at the challenge that I think this discussion and discussions like this are terrific starts at trying to address, the biggest challenge as a country and as a world is that we don't really know what counts as good nutrition, for whom, at what life stages, and why. And we have settled expectations and beliefs based on decades of perceived wisdom, common knowledge, whatever it is, that people are anchored to, and in many instances may not be correct. And so changing beliefs is really hard for anything, for business, for government, for people, and that's something that has to happen if we're going to learn to eat better and what that even means. On the other hand, I think there's tremendous opportunity to find ways to do this, and one of our investments is in the Atkins, Dr. Atkins founded brand weight loss and nutrition business. And we confront this on a daily basis. What's the best, what are we trying to accomplish and for whom? And how do you achieve that as a business objective, which is not always the same, and in many instances is quite different than how we would talk about it in an environment like this. So, but for people who think about the public health implications of eating habits, diabetes, obesity, there are great opportunities to trying to focus on how to solve them.
Well, a little bit tied into what you guys said. I think the biggest challenge that I see is it's a political problem, and this is how large food corporations have this influence on not just policymakers, but on research as well. So I found a little bit of data on land-grant universities and how over the years the public funds have diminished. So they now rely on private funds, mainly from industries like Tyson and Walmart and these big food corporations, and this kind of hinders their research. And they also have buildings at universities named after, like the University of Kansas has 2 buildings named after members of the Tyson family, and 2 buildings named after members of the Walmart family. So this kind of, I think, poses a big challenge, because the research cannot be made purely independently. And there's also the patent on the seeds that Monsanto makes. Because their patent, it prohibits scientists from doing research on it. So going back to what Ezra was saying, like what is healthy, if we don't have access to the research, I think that's a big challenge. And then there's also the farm subsidies that go to all these large corporations and not supporting local farmers. And one thing that I see as a big opportunity is that the food movement is growing, and food activists have put a lot of pressure on legislators and on raising awareness of the food problem. And for example, in Maryland, Maryland was the first state that banned arsenic in chicken feed, and the FDA just banned it recently. So I feel like the food activists have made some impact on politicians, on the public, and just raising awareness. And I think that there's an opportunity for more of that, so that we keep it going.
Hi, everybody. Well, I'll just tell you the challenges and opportunities I see based on some of my research. So one of the big challenges that I see is getting people access to food and to healthy food in particular. So just a few little statistics for you. So 13.6 million people live in census tracts that are categorized as food deserts. That means that in an urban area that you're more than 1 mile from a supermarket, and in a rural area you're more than 10 miles from a supermarket. There's approximately 3 million New Yorkers who experience difficulty affording food for themselves and their families. Throughout the 5 boroughs, approximately 1.3 million people rely on soup kitchens and soup pantries. So as you can see, there's a big issue of getting enough food to people, and then there's this additional issue of getting healthy food for people. So I think that's the first challenge, and I think the second challenge that's related to that is, what does access mean? And if you have access, so let's say that you have a supermarket in your neighborhood or you have something close by, are you actually choosing the healthy food? So first step is access, but second step is actually the choice of the healthy food and the consumption of the healthy food. And so there's a lot of research that suggests that access does not equal choice, that people don't always actually choose healthy food when they have healthy foods in their neighborhoods. So the first step is actually getting people the chance to have the healthy food, and then the second step is helping people think about the choices that they make and encouraging healthy behaviors. So I think the biggest opportunity in food issues today is that there's a lot of interest on food today. So there's a lot of interest in obesity, and I think most US citizens understand that obesity is a problem, that sort of eating healthy is on the minds of Americans. So I think this is a great opportunity to do something. There's a chance to be strategic and try and get people to make better choices, and also help people get better access.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. So let's jump in on some of these topics. Maybe we can start on something. This is a policy school, and we'll start with a general question about what's the role of government in food, and how has that changed, especially in recent years as we've seen interest in food grow. Jonathan, you want to start there?
Sure. It's obviously a very difficult question to answer. And striking the right balance for a role, whether it's the government, a school, an individual, between trying to assure protection and trying to let the market forces and freedom of choice operate, is a struggle, and it's going to be a struggle in any decision-making process. I think one of the examples that was really interesting over the past years was the BPA controversy. So bisphenol A, which is a plastic that is an endocrine disruptor, was under a great deal of scrutiny. And the FDA, while I was there, was focused on how to manage BPA. Should BPA be removed? Anybody here think BPA should be on the market? Okay. So you say that because the literature suggests very strongly, it's not proven, but I think anybody would agree that it's true, that BPA can disrupt certain endocrine pathways which would be very relevant to a developing child, to a fetus or a developing child. So you wouldn't want that. And we know that if you get X amount, there's this much of a risk, very science-based. So then you draw the logical conclusion, let's get rid of BPA. Everybody agrees so far. What are you going to use in its place? What are you going to use as the sealant in cans so that canned goods can remain stable on the shelves? Do you know that there's no product that's actually been tested enough to know whether it's better, worse, or the same? So oftentimes what ends up happening is you come to a certain point with the data where you know that there may be a problem, but then you're faced with a balance. Is the known problem so bad that you should embrace the unknowable? And I think the FDA actually handled it well by sending signals for several years to industry that understood what was going on, even though the FDA was criticized for bending to industry. What it was doing was saying to industry, you better get busy figuring out another chemical to use and give us some data that assures us, because otherwise we're going to have to do something and it's going to be bad for everybody. So there is a place for government to act, and it's usually more complicated than it seems from the outside of the government decision-making process.
I mean, that might suggest that if there's a profit motive, the business will move toward it, and otherwise they'll just be kind of dragging their heels. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I'm smiling as Jonathan finished because I was thinking that what the takeaway message the FDA delivered was get busy figuring out a solution before I have to do something that makes no sense. And that is, I mean, before, we can talk about the profit motive, but on the topic of regulation in food, there are, it's probably too broad a term, but many of the policies that have been set forth and pursued by our government, other governments around the world, have been over time, probably started without scientific basis, B, were disproven or serious questions were raised about them, but they persisted because nobody had because it's hard to change views. And the clearest example to me, for the topic today, is the food pyramid, which in this country existed for 70 years without an original scientific basis, and suggesting to people and teaching from children on and across the country families to raise their children to eat a selection of nutritional inputs that was largely carbohydrate based. And it's really complicated to tease out all the complications of it, but today we have a crisis of diabetes in this country that's almost certainly and incontrovertibly driven by excess consumption of carbohydrates. And we've seen this coming for decades, and we haven't really been able to address it. And so I'm happy to pipe down on policy and talk about business, but realistically, it's hard when you're dealing with unknowables and things that take years or hard to study nutrition. You can't lock somebody up and control what they eat. It's, I think, from the point of view of policy, some modesty in what we really know, and balancing in the corporate world, disclosure is the right policy. So we don't necessarily know the answer, but you better tell people everything you can tell them and let them decide for themselves. And I think one idea is that maybe people need more information and not more direction when it comes to making choices about eating.
Could I add something to that? I think a really interesting question for this whole area is the evidence base, and thinking about the soundness of the studies, and also thinking about the magnitude of effects. And so I don't personally know the BPA literature, but something that occurred to me is I would want to know how big is the negative consequence, or how big are the associations? So not just only statistical significance, but also impact, and what's the impact of using BPA? And so I think that a big question, or a big thing to think about in all of this area of food, is to try and understand what we know and what we don't know, sort of to go along with Ezra's point. But to also realize that we can't always know, and sometimes we're going to have to act not having the perfect experiment or the perfect answer. And so there's pretty strong evidence that suggests that BPA is a problem, but the question is, how much of it? And then, as you said, what are the alternatives?
Our awareness, I want to go to you, Angelica, because you mentioned the awareness of food, and we all are sort of more aware of food, it seems, almost suddenly in about a decade. Of course, it's been longer than that, people are talking about it. But something changed, the so-called tipping point. It does seem like we reached that, and what do you think we know now that we didn't know maybe 10, 15 years ago?
Well, I think GMOs, for the most part. GMOs have been around since the 70s, so it's not something new. It's not a new seed. It's been, to the point where, like, if the country decided to ban it, it wouldn't be a good thing to do, because they will have to re-soil half of the country. So it wouldn't work. But I think this is something that nobody really knew before. I grew up eating Cheerios for breakfast every morning, and it never occurred to me to read a food label for that. So I think this is something that people do now very consciously. Read labels, and I think people are really seeking for information. So there's all these blogs that are created on surrounding food issues and what's healthy to eat, and this is the reason why now all of us probably at some point have eaten quinoa and flax seeds, and because we've been told that this is the healthy solution. We've been eating horrible stuff, and now this is the things that we should eat, and this is all driven not by studies that said flax seeds are healthy for you, is by people. Other people are telling you this. So you kind of follow that. And then also another important thing is the mistrust of industry. I think people now don't trust the industry and the government for that matter, especially when it comes to the labels, because there's all these confusion about it, and especially with the GMO labeling. I think that has been tried in California, it has been tried in Washington, and it hasn't been, the politicians are not doing anything about it. So I feel that one of the government's role in this is to provide the information. I agree with Ezra that it's not about choosing for people, it's about giving people all the information out there and making research possible, and don't have universities and scientists jump through all these hurdles to make independent studies. I feel like that's very important.
Well, businesses definitely poured money into California and Washington State, those ballot issues on GMO. Ezra, you were talking about full disclosure. Do you think that business is ready to, what's different about GMO? Because actually we eat GMO products, a high percentage we already eat.
Yeah.
But this awareness has changed. What's different, do you think, about GMO and disclosure?
Well, I would start by saying I'm no expert in GMO, but I would say that my guess is it's probably too broad a label, but we need labels like this in order to organize activities and responses. So as a term, I would guess covers a range of different kinds of products that were grown differently or engineered for different purposes. Engineering a different root is different than engineering a different carbohydrate in a piece of corn. I don't know this area. I think I agree though with Angelica. The choice and awareness is the most powerful protection against a lot of what we're here to discuss. So if people have the ability to know whether a product they're eating was made, is genetically modified, is it organic, is it local, where was it produced? If you use regulation to give people more information, then over time markets will adapt and we'll actually be able to scale production techniques to deliver what people prefer, and we'll be able to use the power of media maybe to shape preferences so that you can over time drive more behavior that has positive implications. But there are times and ways that regulation can actually limit disclosure and information, and that becomes a real challenge. But in terms of how GMO is regulated, I'm no expert.
So shifting a little bit, just to pose a question about regulation, there's an idea that giving people information and choices would work. Do you think that if we were to say to people that high fructose corn syrup is bad for you, people would stop taking that in?
I think if there is credibility around the message and the messenger, that over time it resonates. But I think it's very difficult for an FDA that tells people to eat however many doses of carbohydrates or that tells people don't eat bacon or don't eat butter, and then goes, turns around. There's not a belief that this is a consistent, clear message from somebody who's been right over time. And that's tough. And people don't know who to listen to, and they don't know what counts as truth here. So in the isolated instance of corn syrup, I suppose people do, actually. I mean, it's probably the case that people do avoid corn syrup to an extent today, whatever the science says. But I don't think we're at a place as a country, culture, or even world where that's where we started. Is there awareness and clarity, and somebody who is seen as a neutral disseminator of information that's not tied into a Monsanto or policy or politics or fundraising? And there may not be an answer. That's why I prefer disclosure, because over time people figure it out. It just may not be immediate, and it may not be coerced. It may take lots of discussions like this and sitcoms that make fun of these topics, and all the ways that information goes from science to conventional wisdom. We probably have to have some patience for here.
Yeah, because first of all, just in defense of my former colleagues, it's the USDA, not the FDA, that puts out the guidelines, okay? I've got friends still at the FDA. On the other hand, the USDA started down the wrong path with all the right intentions in the 1890s. So the USDA funded some of the early research on calorimetry, where they basically would take some food and essentially burn it, for all simplistic way of saying how many calories are released, and came up with this very simple mathematical equation that said energy in minus energy expended tells you how much energy you're going to store in the form of fat, and that's that. So the only way you can lose weight is if you exercise more or eat less. Well, over that next century, one of the things we learned was that there's more than a few bacteria in your gut, and they use up some of the energy too. And not all calories taken in are processed by your body the same way, because what they really have to measure is what's absorbed through the intestine, not what goes down your esophagus. So the whole equation is off to start with, and it's part of why I think all the dietary guidelines were wrong starting in the 1890s, even though they used state-of-the-art 1890s science to come up with it. But it was the USDA.
So what could the FDA do today? You're not there now, but what's something that's happening there on the issue of nutrition that they might be able to do something about?
Well, I think that it's a broader issue than the FDA, but the FDA is really in the right place to set the lead. So one of the things the Obama administration put forward a couple years ago was they wanted to solicit from federal employees ideas for what regulations were redundant, were counterproductive. Let's try to repeal some regulations. It didn't do anything. I don't really know why. I wasn't involved, hanging out with the Obamas discussing this. But I think that if there were something a little more radical suggested, such as if you want to introduce a regulation, you got to take one away. Because there are lots of regulations that mean nothing, and it would not be hard to start stripping away. You start that kind of process, maybe that changes something. Now, the FDA can't do that. That's a congressional mandate. But I think when it comes to regulation, what people often do is they'll point to the FDA or the USDA or the FAA or the FTC or the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The target needs to be Congress. Congress is the body that tells the FDA what to do, and then the FDA does it. So it really is sort of going from the opposite direction if you want to affect change.
So I agree with your point about there are differences from person to person, but wouldn't you agree that the calories in, calories out is at least a good rough approximation of energy stored, or am I way off on that?
I think that my view is very much different than almost anybody you talk to in nutrition. I don't believe that equation's relevant. I don't think all calories are created equal. I think that it starts with one concept that almost every doc has selectively eliminated from his or her brain, or maybe slept through the lecture in biochemistry. So in biochemistry, one of the early lectures you learn is that you make fat from carbohydrates, from glucose. So despite that fact, I'm taught as a medical student, tell your patients to eat a low-fat diet so they don't make fat. Well, that's not how you make fat. You make fat from glucose. So I think that's an example where not all calories are created equal right off the bat, and it doesn't even get into the gut issue. But I think that if you take care, when I took care of patients, and they would eat these diets, and when I look at what I eat in terms of my own weight management, it doesn't actually matter how many calories I take in. It matters what I eat. Now, maybe I'm a subset of the population, but even if that's the case, it's proof that that equation is not an absolute. It's not a law of thermodynamics.
One other aspect of the equation that's problematic is that it assumes that the only variable is what you put in, and that how you expend energy, putting aside the term calorie, is a constant. And I think it's certainly knowable, and we can all relate to it. Your energy level, your activity level is also a function of what you eat. And so when you think about foods that send your blood sugar level up and then down, they actually don't only affect what calories, they affect how much you move around, what we often call our metabolism, but it might also just be our activity level. And that also affects ultimately how what we put in translates into what remains or is stored.
Can I say one other thing about the idea of choices and giving people information? There's a lot of really interesting research that suggests that if you give people a survey and say, well, tell us what you think you should eat. How many servings of this should you have? How many servings of that should you have? Leaving aside whether or not the pyramid is good or not. Most people do a pretty reasonable job of saying, I should eat fruits and vegetables and fewer fats and fewer sugars. But then when you look at what people actually choose to do, even though they know what to do, they don't always choose what to do. So I think this raises a really interesting question for an information strategy is giving information to people actually going to change behavior in a way that we think is helpful? And so I guess we could feel that we're being responsible by giving the information. But if our goal is to be a little bit paternalistic and help change behavior, the information itself, I'm not sure is going to get that much done. But
Well, the choice. So the way that we all know this, that the way that a supermarket is set up is a strategic thing, and so even not talking about food deserts where it might just be a convenience store, even a great supermarket is set up with thousands of products and many of them made with the same ingredients by only a few companies. And this is kind of what you're talking about, which is that there's an illusion of choice, but a lot of the thing, but you know, we all know that we don't make the healthiest choices even if we have access. So this illusion of choice in your scholarship about food deserts, what do you make of that?
well, I think you put it really well, the illusion of choice. So there's my research unfortunately suggests that living in a neighborhood with a supermarket is not correlated with better food choices, not correlated with lower BMI, not correlated with a lower likelihood of obesity. So if we think of policy solutions, it sounds great to, let's get supermarkets into all neighborhoods, but it doesn't seem from the empirical evidence so far that that's actually a strategy that's playing out. And so I think the next question for research is exactly what to do with that illusion of choice. So what's happening in supermarkets? So what's the difference between people's, they get to this store, do they intend to buy healthy food and then they get attracted by the good stuff on outside the aisles? Or, you know, how do we, I don't think we know enough yet about what helps people make healthy choices. So obviously I'm talking about this in, like I said, kind of a paternalistic way, thinking about what government and policy can do to encourage choices. So that's a very different model from what Ezra's thinking about kind of let's give the information and let people make the choices. So I think that's a question for academics to think about, for policymakers to think about what's the right pathway there.
That's an interesting point, because I think that in some ways, at first it seems like you might have different arguments, but I think a lot of us might have assumed that we should, the solution to food deserts would be to put, you know, not even a Whole Foods, but a supermarket in more neighborhoods. But that's surprising to me to hear.
Well, I guess the question is, what are we after with the policy? So it is definitely the case that having a supermarket in a neighborhood makes your life a lot easier. It is easier, you can spend less on food, you spend less time getting food, the stress is lower. So there are many benefits to doing a policy of supermarkets and access to food, but it doesn't look like that's paying off in terms of better food choices. There's a lot of reasons we'd still want to do supermarket access in low-income neighborhoods or access in areas without food, but so far it doesn't look like it's turning into healthy choices. But there's lots of other positives that come out of it, but it doesn't look so far like better choices.
What would count as a healthier food choice?
So most of the studies look at servings of fruits and vegetables. Measuring this, to back to this issue we keep bringing up, like how do you measure this stuff? And so then do you count servings, or do you count calories, or do you count number of consumption events? So these are all like measurement issues. So usually the way the research looks at it is like the number of times per week that you consume fruits and vegetables. And some of the studies try to look at servings, but all that data is really messy. People misreport it.
Can we agree on things that are categorically bad? Because I think that some of the awareness in the last few years has identified some things that we didn't know. You know, high fructose corn syrup is suddenly in the discussion in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I wanted to mention about what Jonathan said about if you told people that high fructose corn syrup was bad, will they still eat it? I think for a large amount of people, or for enough people, it does matter. And industry has realized this, because now you see a bunch of drinks that have this big label in the front that says no high fructose corn syrup. And that means that the sales of their high fructose corn syrup drinks probably dropped. And that's why now they're doing this. So now the new thing is cane sugar juice and beet juice and like all these substitutes for high fructose corn syrup. So I feel that people definitely are paying attention to, and like I said before, it's not necessarily science or a study that said, yes, this is bad for you. It's just, if your friends are not eating it, then you probably shouldn't either. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal today about diet soda and the issue with artificial sweeteners. So first, high fructose corn syrup was bad, so then people switched from the regular soda to the diet soda. And now diet soda is bad too. And there was like this interview of this woman, and she said, well, my trainer told me that aspartame was going to make me fat, so I stopped drinking diet soda. Now, that's not necessarily true. There's, the research is not in that, it wasn't because of research, it's because her trainer told her so. And now Coke reported a drop in sales of diet soda. And so now they're trying to, kind of reinvent the wheel and kind of adjust to consumers' demands. And consumers are definitely demanding the drop of use of chemicals in their food. I think that's the biggest demand.
Do we have a word from a doctor about diet sodas?
Well,
Some practical info.
Well, I think that it's like so many chemicals that if you take a lot of them in, the assumption should be it's probably not good. But there really aren't data that say that it's dangerous to have a Diet Coke or two, or Diet Pepsi. I don't know, where am I speaking? A Diet Soda, I should say.
But this consumer demand is, we're all talking around this, and I think this is a big point of, that's right at the intersection of this. And so if we think of the organic movement, or more foods that have just sprung up in popularity, like organic yogurt or the other examples, I think there's a little bit of the consumer demand, or quite a lot, that says we want organic, and then companies shift. But there's also a cost issue, right? And this is also a financial issue. So I don't know if there's any way to, for organic products or local products to be less expensive than chips and Coke. Someone jump in on that, cost versus health. Do you always buy organic?
I always
Or
do,
putting you on the
actually.
spot.
Yeah, I actually do, and I actually convinced my family to make the investment in our health to just and for organics in particular, it's just I personally try to avoid eating a lot of chemicals. I feel that if nature gave us natural food to eat, why do we have to alter it, in order to eat it? So that's my personal policy when it comes to eating. So, but I feel that, yeah, of course, it's prohibitive for a lot of people because it's expensive. But I think this is because it's a small market. I think when markets get bigger, the prices drop, and the market for packaged food and processed food, it's really big. So they're able to make stuff cheaper as opposed to organic. Organic food, I forget the statistic, but it's something like 10% or 15% of the food supply is organic. So it's really small, which makes it unique, and it makes it expensive. So I think the way to make that cheaper will be to expand it, and the way to expand it is to promote, have policies in place that help local farmers, organic farmers, to, instead of the subsidies going to the corn to make the high fructose corn syrup, they should be going to, the local farmers that are
one
that
issue
have
right
organic
now is
practices.
is that there aren't very many small farmers, as I understand, and also commodity crops are better represented, right? And there's sort of so I think that I certainly know from studying that diversifying crops is another solution.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's certainly the case now that a price per calorie of fruits and vegetables is higher on average across the U.S. than the price for the calorie from other sources of food. So leaving aside the organic issue, which even exacerbates that,
Yeah.
it's more expensive to eat well. It's not impossible, but it's more expensive. And
What's going on culturally that we spend less time cooking too? Because I think that's pretty obvious that that's going on. Does anyone have any guesses as to why? I think it's probably a few reasons, but
there's work on time use that looks at more mothers working outside the home. And so there's an argument that as more women have joined the workforce, that there's been an increased reliance on prepackaged meals or going out to eat.
you know, we're at a college here. I wonder if we, Angelica, you might talk briefly about the interest, the surge in interest in schools of like this one,
Right.
of studying food, and what will students do when they leave? What do they aspire to do with that knowledge?
Right. Well, I think for me and several members of our club, there's this big interest in us policy students. What are the things that we can do in terms of shifting policies to, or get policymakers to focus more on this food problem? And I think what everybody is aspiring to do once, and we're also writing our master's thesis on food issues. And we're doing this because we feel that, you know, this is something that we're interested in. This is something that we want to do our own research on, and have these ideas and hopefully work either with policymakers and, you know, kind of put that on the table that, well, this is a specific food issue that I'm interested in, and now I'm working for you, and I'd like you as a legislator to bring this forward, or I'd like to work with local community organizations, local nonprofits that have specific issues that they want legislators to think about. And, you know, now that I'm there, I would do this, or I can also, you know, work for a nonprofit, a consumer advocacy nonprofit that does research on food issues or, you know, health issues also. So there's certainly many areas that our students want to go to, but definitely with the food policy focus in place.
If there were one thing I wish I would have known earlier in my career, it was how rewarding it could be to work within the government. And I never thought I would ever hear myself say that growing up, believe me. But the chance to actually contribute and also learn from the inside is a very, very empowering role to play. So one of the things that I would urge the students to consider here is that kind of a move, whether it's working for a legislator who I think represents a lot of the real power in making policy decisions, or working within government in a regulatory body so you understand how to implement them and what goes into decision making. Those would be really valuable paths to consider.
You asked about, is there anything that's unambiguously bad? And there may be, but if you think about many of the things that are perceived as unambiguously bad, over time our perceptions of those things change. If you ask people today, is there anything good about pesticides? You'd probably get a lot of blank stares, or people would agree that there isn't. But the development of pesticides probably allowed, you know, people to live and eat in greater numbers than ever before, and really change the world. And eliminating them might be better for some people here. If we prefer pesticide-free food, you're going to get lower yields per acre. You're going to get crops that don't make it as long in the distribution from soil to table or to shelf or to boat to transport overseas, and what you're going to get is less food. And we look at the world as a country totally differently today because we actually can produce more food than we need. But that's an incredibly recent phenomenon. And so one of the challenges then is to think about, rather than trying to isolate aspects of challenges in our nutrition system, if you will, as good or bad, I think appreciating the pros and cons of any of these things is really important. And the markets will, for better and worse, and it's not only either or, will calibrate. So if more people want organic, we'll get more organic absent interference with the ability to deliver it. That's not an unambiguously good thing. Food is more expensive. More acreage is dedicated to crops that, there's water implications, by the way, on both sides of the equation as you have lower output per farm acre, and that creates issues in different parts of the country. It's just all complicated, and that's why earlier I said I thought, allowing this to iterate, giving people information and allowing the market to respond, it's not perfect, and it doesn't allow us to control all the outcomes, but it allows us to evolve towards better status quos maybe. And it's really hard to figure out. I don't know that there's a controllable way to figure out in every instance, given all the implications that it all has on other aspects of our lives, what the right answer for anything is.
It's true that consumers have driven a lot of demand for, in a lot of cases, healthier food. But I think we might also be able to agree that there are some unsustainable parts to the food system, the healthcare being one. And I was hoping Jonathan could speak briefly of the stat that you all see is, since if you were born after 2000, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting the adult onset diabetes. And you're a cardiologist, so that seems sort of unsustainable. That's sort of one of those scary statistics that our children's generation might be less healthy than the current one, which is not supposed to be how it is. I do think that the consumer demand in the market is a positive, can be part of this, but isn't that kind of unsustainable? I mean, if we keep going in this direction?
Yeah, the growth of that problem of type 2 diabetes, the blindness, renal failure, heart attacks, strokes, amputations, the cost to society just in financial terms, even if you didn't care about the impact on the people and their family, and I'm not suggesting that that should be your attitude, but just the financial aspect poses economic and therefore national security issues. So you can start with that. And I think that the other aspect of the increased incidence of diabetes that's worth considering is how choice has played a role in its development. So if you go back a few decades, there was really this onset in trends of obesity starting in the 80s. And about a decade before that was where high fructose corn syrup entered the market. Now this may sound a little bit like I'm being redundant, but I think that there's, in terms of a research project for a graduate student, look at that correlation. Boy, it's impressive when you download the numbers from the USDA and you download the numbers from CDC and you look at it, you see the non-fructose corn syrup go up and then the obesity rate go up.
And probably
they just
the price of corn is going down.
Going down. And then what you see is another phenomenon where there are additional sweeteners. So if you put all sweeteners together, not just high fructose corn syrup, you see that relationship continues through the data that exists for the last, it's a couple years old now, but going from 1972 on up. So I'm not even convinced that the shift from high fructose corn syrup to other simple carbohydrates is any solution. I think it's just going to continue to drive the problem. Then where I think the danger is in this example is that the way I see people react to sugars, I think it's almost like a drug. If you were to look at some of the studies with functional MRI of the brain, imaging studies like that, what you see is that a lot of the areas that are light up in drug addicts that produce dopamine light up when people get their carbohydrate, get their sugar. So if you have a system where you're going to say we need access to good stuff but choice for what people want, and we let all those basically simple sugars continue to flood the market, people are going to vote with their actions. They're going to make the bad choices because we've allowed them to almost become addicted to glucose. And as long as that exists, it serves as an example where we have to be willing to tackle the issue of the paternalism or maternalism and say, how do we do something here? We don't want to say it's illegal to make sugar because we can't afford to pay unemployment benefits for all the people in the sugar industry. So we have to try to figure out a way to take care of the whole picture, and nobody's really done that yet.
There are a couple other trends that happened at the same time as obesity was increasing. So the fact that high fructose corn syrup was introduced definitely trends along with the trends of obesity. But I think something that is a hard question for researchers is trying to figure out to what extent is high fructose corn syrup responsible for the increase, right? So if we knew what percentage, then we could really have a strong policy to say, we're not doing that anymore. But there's other trends that happened at the same time. So there's increase in sedentary jobs. So in the same trend when obesity is increasing, so more and more jobs became sedentary, so more people are sitting at their desks. There was also less smoking, which this strangely has an effect on obesity that we wouldn't necessarily predict, but less smoking has potentially led to more weight gain. So I just raise this as not to say that the rise of the sugar is not part of the problem, but as an empirical question, figuring out how much sugar is responsible for it, it's complicated because we've got these other things that are trending at the same time, increasing at the same time. So getting a causal story about sugar, it's hard. It suggests that the association suggests it exists, but we don't know for sure.
The marketing of food, especially marketing of food to children, I think that, this is something that, if you have a child and your child had, I don't know, Lucky Charms once, it would, that already creates that sugar addiction that you were talking about before. And now, why did the kid want Lucky Charms? Because there was a commercial and, there's all these things and ads, and they probably put the Lucky Charms at eye level of 4-year-olds so that, they can grab them without you even noticing. So, I think for parents that poses a big problem, not only with what, do you feed your children, but, once they go to school, what, when they have lunch breaks and stuff, like their friends are eating something totally different than you're eating, and that causes a big problem. And this is all because of the way food is marketed to people and, to children. So I think that's also, that also plays a part.
Thanks, everybody, for coming this evening.
Yeah.